In order to understand the deeper legal issues around land law, it's important for us to understand the role that equity plays within land law and the distinction between legal interest in land and equitable interest in land. So what I'm going to do for the next series of videos, I think 4 or 5 videos, is talk about first introducing the concept of equity in land law. Then talk about specific legal interests in land, what is required for a legal interest to be valid in land, and the same for equitable interests, and also look at equitable remedies, because these are things that are going to come up quite a lot throughout this series of videos. Things that when we're talking about things like covenants and things like mortgages and trusts in land as well, these are all things that are important to discuss. So it's important to have a baseline foundational understanding of the role of equity in land law before we go into specific issues. So the law of equity does have a very close relationship with the law of land law. So it's important that we understand the distinction between the two and this relationship in more detail. So really, the first thing we're going to look at is where is equity found when we're talking about land law. And the intervention of equity in land law can be seen in 2 main areas. There are 2 broad categories of equitable relationships within land law, and these are firstly the equitable interests in land. Equity creates new interests in land where legal interests fall down effectively. And the same can be said for equitable remedies. Equity makes new remedies in land as well. And as such, we have a system where we have a dual purpose for land law. We have the intervention of equity, and so that an interest in land can either be equitable in nature or it could be legal in nature, or the other way around, legal in nature or equitable in nature. They could have either legal status or equitable status. So that's what's important here. And this is just going to be an introductory lesson where we just outline very broadly the distinction between the 2 branches of law, and in the next video we'll talk about specifically the history of the development of equity in land law, and then we'll talk about equitable remedies, then we'll talk about legal interest in land, and then we'll talk about equitable interest in land. So when we talk about a legal interest in land, it should be noted that an interest in land can only be legal, okay, if it is listed, if it is one of the interests that is listed in Section 1(2) of the Law of Property Act 1925, as will be the LPA from now on. We'll write it as the LPA. So if an interest in land is legal, it has to be listed under this provision. And as will be discussed later, being on this list does not guarantee there being a valid interest in a valid legal interest in land. So not only does it have to be on this list within this provision for it to be a legal interest, but a number of formalities must also be met for this to be the case. So it has to firstly be listed on the Law of Property Act Section 1(2), and it also second has to meet the required formalities, and the required formalities tend to be depend on the specific legal interest that we're talking about. There are a great number of listed interests in land that we can talk about, but the first formality that really is quite universal across all of the interest in land is that a person granting an interest in land must have capacity to grant said interest, which is almost common sense. If you want to grant an interest in land, you must have the capability, the capacity to do so. When we talk about equitable interests in land, again, there are a great number of different equitable interests in land that equity has developed over the years, and we will discuss all of them in a separate video on equitable interests. And these can include interests which may have the capacity to be legal, but they fail at one of the hurdles to do so. They don't meet all the requirements. Usually, they don't meet the formalities that are provided for. And an interest will only have equitable status where equity finds a specifically enforceable valid contract to create the interest. And we will find when we look at some more legislation later on in the series of videos that a certain number of requirements must be met for it to be an enforceable valid contract. But if there is a valid contract in place, this is a baseline understanding. It's a basic requirement for equity to find an interest in land. Just like with legal interests as well, in order for an interest to be equitable, there also has to be a certain number of formalities that are met. So, just as we discussed when we're talking about legal interests in land, equitable interests in land also have to have a certain number of formalities. And again, just like with legal interests, these formalities will differ depending on the type of interest. And then we'll do more on this in a later lesson as well. So, as a very, very brief introduction, we must note that land law, interests in land, if we just go up here, so interests in land can be split into equitable and legal. And the requirements for one being an equitable interest and one being a legal interest will depend on the specific interest that we're talking about. And we will use lots of different examples as we go on, and we start to go into detail specifically on the Law of Property Act as well. And it's just important that we have an understanding of the two branches of law when we're talking about interest in land, because when we come on to talking about the idea of trusts in land, and we start to talk about things like mortgages as well, as is a very important one, it's important that we understand that there is this distinction, and that some interest in land can be equitable and some can be legal. And it generally, if we're talking about the history, generally equitable interests in land sort of arise where there is a failure or a deficiency in the law relating to legal interests in land. And we'll talk about why and how this developed in the next video.